Marcus never thought that one simple walk home could change so much. It was late afternoon, and the sun was slowly setting, painting the sky with soft orange and pink colors. The street was calm, lined with neat houses and freshly cut lawns. Children's bicycles were left in front yards, and a dog barked somewhere in the distance. Marcus had his basketball in one hand and his backpack on his shoulder. He had just finished practice and was tired but happy. His sneakers tapped against the sidewalk as he walked, humming quietly to himself. For him, this was just another ordinary day, but someone else didn't see it that way. From her porch, a woman sat with a glass of iced tea, watching everything with sharp eyes. She noticed Marcus the moment he turned onto the street. To her, he didn't look like a kid coming home from practice. To her, he looked like someone who didn't belong. The way he wore his hoodie, the way he kept his head down, the color of his skin, it all added up in her mind to something suspicious. She didn't know Marcus. She didn't care to know him. She only saw what her fears told her to see. Marcus felt the weight of her stare, but tried to ignore it. He was used to it. Too many times he had noticed people watching him with the same uneasy expression, like he was trouble before he even spoke a word. He kicked a small stone on the sidewalk and sighed. He just wanted to get home, grab some food, and maybe play his video games before dinner. That was all. But the woman's thoughts grew darker. She leaned forward, whispering to herself, "Why is he here? What is he doing?" She imagined things that weren't real. Maybe he was looking at houses. Maybe he was planning something bad. Fear twisted her mind until she convinced herself she needed to act. Inside her house, her phone sat on the table. She picked it up, still staring at Marcus. Her heart raced as if she were in danger, even though Marcus hadn't even looked at her house. She told herself, it's better to be safe than sorry. Her hand shook slightly as she dialed 911. Marcus, unaware of what was happening, stopped for a moment to tie his shoelace. The sun was warm on his back, and a breeze rustled the leaves above him. He thought of his father, who was supposed to be home early today, and smiled. Maybe they would eat together tonight. Maybe his dad would tell him more stories from his time in the Navy. Marcus always loved those stories. They made him proud, even though he didn't tell his friends much about it. On the other end of the phone, the sheriff's dispatcher answered quickly. The woman's voice was sharp, filled with fake urgency. "Yes, there's someone suspicious in the neighborhood," she said. "A young black male, walking slowly, looking at houses. I don't know what he's planning, but it doesn't feel right." Marcus bent down to pick up his basketball, still lost in his own thoughts. He didn't know his life was about to change in the next few minutes. He didn't know that, just by walking home, he had already been judged, accused, and labeled by someone who didn't even know his name. The woman hung up and sat straighter in her chair. Proud of what she thought was a smart decision, she believed. She had done the neighborhood a favor, that she had protected her street. Little did she know, she had just started something that would expose her own prejudice to everyone around her. A car drove by slowly, the driver glancing at Marcus before rolling on. Marcus waved politely, but the driver didn't wave back. He was used to that too. Sometimes it felt like no matter how polite he was, no matter how much he smiled, people had already decided who he was before he even spoke. Marcus adjusted his backpack and kept walking, dreaming about dinner and laughing. With his dad, to him, nothing was wrong. To the woman, everything was wrong. And soon, the sound of sirens would prove how different their worlds were. That quiet afternoon, filled with sunshine and calm, was about to turn tense. And the first step of the story had been set in motion, not by Marcus, not by anything he had done, but by the fear inside someone else's mind. The phone in the woman's hand felt heavier than usual, as if she were about to make a call that carried more weight than she understood. Her thumb hesitated over the green button for just a second, but then she pressed it. A sharp beep, a click, And suddenly, the calm afternoon turned into something else. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, steady, and professional. The woman sat up straighter in her chair, her iced tea rattling in its glass. Her eyes were locked on Marcus, who was still walking, head down, minding his own business. Her voice came out firm, but trembling with false urgency. "Yes, I'd like to report someone suspicious in my neighborhood," she said. "There's a young black male walking slowly, looking around at houses. I don't know what he's doing here, but it doesn't feel right." Her words carried no truth, only fear and imagination, but they painted Marcus as a threat. On the other end, the dispatcher quickly typed notes into the system. The words "suspicious person" and "possible trespasser" flashed on the screen, tagged with a neighborhood address. The information was immediately sent out to the nearest sheriff's unit. Meanwhile, Marcus had no idea his quiet walk was turning into a police matter. He had just spotted a basketball net hanging in someone's driveway and thought about asking his dad to buy one for their own house. He smiled to himself, bouncing his ball gently against the sidewalk. But in the woman's mind, every small movement was twisted into something else. When he paused to look at the net, she told the dispatcher he's stopping to stare at houses, like he's planning something. When he adjusted his backpack, she added, now he's fidgeting with his bag, maybe hiding something inside. Her words were painting Marcus into a picture he didn't deserve. "Ma'am, what exactly is he doing right now?" the dispatcher asked, keeping her tone calm. He's just walking. But it doesn't look normal," the woman insisted. "We don't usually see people like him here." That last sentence said more than she realized. The dispatcher noted it silently but didn't respond to the comment. Her job wasn't to judge motives, was to record and dispatch help at that moment. Marcus stopped at the corner to retie his shoelace again. Sweat from basketball practice dripped down his forehead, and he wiped it with the sleeve of his hoodie. He looked tired, not dangerous. But the woman narrowed her eyes, whispering to herself, "He's stalling. He's waiting for something." Her imagination turned ordinary actions into threats. Within minutes, the sheriff's deputy responded to the call. The radio in his car buzzed, and he was given the report. "Suspicious person, young male, possibly casing houses." The words sank into his mind before he even saw Marcus. The seed of suspicion had already been planted. Back on the street, Marcus finally noticed the woman still staring. He gave a polite nod, trying to show friendliness, but she didn't return it. Instead, she spoke softly into the phone again. "Yes, he just looked at me. Please hurry. I don't feel safe." Marcus frowned, confused. He shook his head and kept walking, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping into his chest. He didn't know a patrol car was already on its way. The dispatcher tried to keep the woman calm. "Ma'am, stay inside your home if you feel unsafe. An officer will be there shortly." The woman hung up the phone and exhaled deeply, as if she had just saved the day. She didn't think about the consequences. She didn't think about the boy's innocence. All she thought was, now the sheriff will take care of it. Across the street, a neighbor peeked out from behind her curtains, having overheard some of the woman's conversation. She saw Marcus too, and recognized him. He had walked past her house dozens of times before. She shook her head sadly, muttering, "That boy isn't hurting anyone." But she didn't step outside. Fear of conflict kept her silent. The world around Marcus seemed peaceful, the golden sunlight, the sound of cicadas, the cool breeze. But underneath that peace, a storm was brewing. Every word spoken on that 911 call had set events into motion that couldn't easily be undone. In the distance, the low hum of a police siren began to grow louder. Marcus didn't hear it yet. He was still lost in his own thoughts, dreaming of going home, eating dinner with his dad. maybe even challenging him to a quick game of basketball in the driveway. But the sheriff's car was getting closer with every second, and the woman on the porch leaned back in her chair, satisfied. She didn't realize that soon the decision she had made in fear would not only backfire, but also reveal a truth that would leave her and everyone else watching completely speechless. The 911 call was over, but the consequences had only just begun. The sound of tires crunching against the road broke the calm of the neighborhood. A white sheriff's patrol car rolled slowly into the street, its headlights reflecting off the houses. The car didn't use its siren, but the flashing lights on top spun red and blue across the quiet homes, creating an uneasy glow. Birds that had been resting on a power line scattered into the sky. Marcus noticed the car almost immediately. His heart skipped. He hadn't done anything wrong. He knew that, but seeing police lights always made him nervous. He clutched his basketball tighter and slowed his steps, not wanting to seem like he was running away. His dad had always told him, if you ever get stopped, stay calm, be polite. Don't give them a reason to think you're a threat. Those words echoed in his mind now. The patrol car stopped a few feet ahead of him. The sheriff's deputy stepped out, a tall man in his late 40s with a stern look and a hand resting near his belt. He scanned Marcus from head to toe in silence, already forming opinions before a single word was spoken. "Hey you," the deputy called out firmly. "What are you doing around here?" Marcus swallowed, his voice quiet but respectful. "I'm just walking home, sir. I live a few blocks away." The deputy narrowed his eyes. "You live here? In this neighborhood?" His tone carried disbelief, as if Marcus's words didn't fit the picture in his mind. "Yes, sir," Marcus repeated, pointing down the street. "My house is right over there. I was at basketball practice." He lifted the ball slightly. As proof, the woman from the porch stood now, arms folded, her eyes bright with self-satisfaction. She shouted toward the deputy, "That's him. That's the one I called about. He's been acting suspicious, walking back and forth, staring at houses." Marcus turned his head, shocked. "What? No, I wasn't." The deputy held up a hand, cutting him off. "Quiet. I'll ask the questions." His voice was firm, commanding, leaving no space for Marcus to defend himself. Marcus's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of the deputy's stare, the suspicion in his voice. His palms grew sweaty around the basketball, but he forced himself to stay still. His father's lessons echoed against a calm. Don't argue. Don't let fear show. The deputy stepped closer, looking at the backpack slung over Marcus's shoulder. "What's in the bag?" he asked sharply. "Just my clothes, sir." "And a water bottle." Marcus moved slowly, carefully, as he unzipped the bag halfway to show him. The deputy peered inside, but said nothing, his expression still hard by now. A few neighbors had come out to see what was happening. Some whispered quietly, others pulled out phones to record. The red and blue lights bounced off their faces as they stood in small clusters at the edges of their driveways. One older man muttered, "I've seen that kid before. He's not causing trouble." Another neighbor shook her head, whispering, "It's not right, but I don't want to get involved." Their voices stayed low, drowned out by the hum of the patrol car's engine. The woman on the porch, however, grew bolder. She called out again, "See? He doesn't even belong here. We don't usually have his kind walking around." Who knows what he was planning? Marcus's eyes stung with anger and embarrassment, but he bit his lip. He wanted to shout to defend himself, but he stayed quiet. Every instinct told him that one wrong word, one wrong move, could make things worse. The deputy radioed back to the station. "I've got the subject here, still checking things out." His eyes stayed locked on Marcus, watching for the slightest sign of resistance. Marcus stood still, his shoulders tense, his heart beat loud in his ears. He had never felt more out of place in a street he had walked countless times before. The air around him felt heavy, filled with suspicion and silence. Then, just when it seemed the situation might spiral further, a deep, familiar voice broke through the tension. "Is there a problem here, officer?" The crowd turned. Marcus's father was walking quickly toward them, tall and commanding, his steps strong and steady. His eyes were locked on his son, but his presence alone shifted. The entire mood of the street, Marcus let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through him. His father was here. The deputy straightened slightly, glancing at the man approaching. He didn't know who he was yet, but something in the man's confidence made him pause. The woman on the porch froze, her mouth half open. She hadn't expected anyone to show up, especially not the boy's father. And she certainly didn't know what kind of man he really was. Marcus stood taller now, his fear fading as his father drew closer. He knew everything was about to change. The sheriff's arrival had turned the quiet street into a stage. The lights, the whispers, the accusations, all of it had built up to this moment. But the real shock was still to come, carried in the presence of the man who had just arrived. Asterisk, the flashing red and blue lights kept spinning, casting colors across windows, cars, and faces. What started as a quiet afternoon was now turning into the center of attention. One by one, neighbors began stepping outside, drawn by curiosity, confusion, and a little fear. At first, it was just one man peeking through his blinds. Then another neighbor stepped onto his porch, folding his arms as he tried to figure out what was happening. Within minutes, more doors opened and people slowly gathered along the street. The once peaceful neighborhood was no longer quiet. Whispers filled the air. Some people leaned close to each other, speaking softly, while others simply stared. Their eyes moved from Marcus, who stood nervously with his basketball and backpack, to the deputy, whose hand never strayed far from his belt. The tension was clear, and everyone could feel it. Marcus's father walked closer, his tall frame cutting through the crowd. But before he reached his son, the murmurs began to rise louder. "Is that the Johnson boy?" One woman whispered. "Think so," another replied. "I've seen him walk this way after school before. Why would the sheriff be here if he wasn't guilty of something?" A man muttered. Those words cut through Marcus like sharp glass. He wanted to shout back, to tell them the truth, that he was just a kid heading home, that he hadn't done a single thing wrong. But the weight of so many eyes on him made his throat feel tight. He stood frozen, clutching his basketball like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. On the porch, the woman who had called the sheriff puffed out her chest. Her voice carried louder now that she had an audience. "See? This is exactly what I was worried about," she said, pointing a finger at Marcus. Walking up and down the street, stopping in front of houses, staring too long. That's not normal behavior. Some nodded in agreement, their fear feeding on her words. Others looked uneasy, glancing between Marcus and the woman. Decoud? See, he wasn't dangerous, but none of them spoke up. Not yet. A younger neighbor, holding her phone, started recording quietly. The camera focused on Marcus, the deputy, and the woman on the porch. She whispered to her friend beside her, "I don't like this. He's just a kid." Her friend nodded, but neither stepped forward. The crowd kept growing. Children pressed against their parents' sides, sensing the tension, but not fully understanding. A dog barked from behind a fence, adding to the noise. The once friendly street was now divided, suspicion hanging heavy in the air. Marcus's father finally reached the edge of the scene. His deep voice carried authority as he spoke. "That's my son. What's going on here?" The deputy glanced at him, still wary. "Sir, please step back. We received a call about suspicious activity." The woman jumped in eagerly, her words sharp. "That's him. That boy doesn't belong here." I saw him acting strange, looking around like he was planning something. I know trouble when I see it. Marcus's father's jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed calm. He looked around at the growing crowd, then back at the deputy. His son's face told him everything: fear, confusion, and the silent plea for protection. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, like a storm building. Some people started to doubt the woman's claims. "Suspicious? He looks like he just came from practice," one man muttered. "He's carrying a basketball, for crying out loud." But others still sided with her, their fear making them blind. "You never know these days," someone else said. "Better safe than sorry." Marcus stood silently, his cheeks burning with shame. He had never felt so exposed. Every pair of eyes judged him differently, some with suspicion, some with pity, and a few with quiet understanding. But to him, it felt like the whole world was against him. The deputy shifted uncomfortably. He could feel the weight of the crowd too. Every move he made was being watched, recorded, and whispered about. The air grew heavy, and the situation threatened to spiral further. Marcus's father finally stepped forward, placing a steady hand on his son's shoulder. His calm voice cut through the noise. "My boy hasn't done anything wrong. He lives here. He belongs here, just like everyone else." The woman scoffed loudly. "Oh, really? Then why was he sneaking around?" That word, sneaking, hung in the air like poison. Marcus's father's eyes hardened, but his voice remained steady. He knew anger wouldn't help his son. He knew the real moment to speak would come soon. The crowd shifted uneasily, divided between suspicion and doubt. The woman's accusations had started this storm. But the truth was about to shatter it. No one knew yet who Marcus's father really was. No one knew the power, the respect, and the authority he carried in his name. But as the crowd swelled and the whispers grew, the stage was set for a reveal that would silence them all. The neighborhood was watching closely, every eye fixed on the father and son. The tension had reached its peak, and all it would take was one truth to change everything. The crowd kept whispering, the deputy kept questioning, and Marcus stood frozen. His basketball pressed tightly against his chest. Every second felt longer, heavier. He wanted to disappear, to run home and slam the door behind him. But he knew he couldn't. His father's words about staying calm were the only thing holding him steady. Then, from the far end of the street, footsteps echoed with firm rhythm. They weren't rushed, but they carried a strength that demanded attention. Heads turned one by one, and a quiet wave moved through the crowd as they noticed a tall figure approaching. It was Marcus's father. He walked with purpose. His broad shoulders straight, his face calm but serious. There was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation in his stride. Every step seemed to push back against the tension that hung in the air. For Marcus, it was like watching a lighthouse appear through a storm, steady, strong, unshaken. The deputy noticed him too. His hand twitched near his belt again, but something about the man's presence made him pause. This wasn't someone stumbling into the scene by accident. This was someone who carried authority without even needing a badge. "Is there a problem here, officer?" the man asked, his voice deep and commanding, but steady as stone. Marcus's heart leaped. That voice was familiar, powerful, safe. His father had arrived, and in that moment, Marcus knew he wasn't alone anymore. The deputy cleared his throat. "Sir, please stand back. We received a call about suspicious behavior in the area. We're handling it." The woman on the porch, her confidence growing again, pointed sharply at Marcus. "That's him. That's the boy. I told you, he doesn't belong here. He was sneaking around, staring at people's houses. I know trouble when I see it." Marcus's father turned his eyes toward her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He simply looked at her with a kind of steady gaze that made her words falter. Then he looked back at the deputy. "That boy you're talking about," he said firmly, "is my son." The crowd stirred. Whispers rose higher. "His son," someone murmured. "Wait, they live here?" another asked. A ripple of doubt began to spread. The deputy frowned, still trying to process. "Sir, do you live in this neighborhood?" "Yes," Marcus's father replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We live just down the street. My son walks this way every day. He's coming home from practice, nothing more." The woman scoffed loudly, refusing to back down. "That can't be true. I've never seen him before. People like him don't." She stopped herself, but the meaning was already clear. Her words hung in the air like poison. Marcus lowered his head, shame and anger burning inside him. But his father's hand came to rest on his shoulder, steady and strong. It was more than comfort, it was a shield. The deputy shifted uncomfortably. He looked at Marcus, then at his father, then at the woman. The weight of the crowd pressing in, the recording phones, the tension, it was all building. He knew this was no ordinary situation anymore. Marcus's father took one more step forward. His presence seemed to fill the space, quieting the whispers around them. Even the children who had been chattering softly grew silent. He spoke again, his voice calm, but carrying authority that could not be ignored. "My son hasn't done anything wrong. He belongs here. He has every right to walk these streets without being treated like a criminal." The deputy hesitated. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself. The confidence with which he had questioned Marcus earlier was gone, replaced by something else, caution, the woman. However, still refused to see the truth. She crossed her arms and said, "If he really belongs here, then prove it. Show us something. Anyone can say they live here." The crowd shifted again, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus's father didn't flinch. He simply looked at her with steady eyes, as if he were a teacher waiting for a student to realize their mistake. In that moment, Marcus stood taller. He could feel his father's strength flowing into him, reminding him that he wasn't powerless. The storm was still raging, but now his father was here to face it with him. The air felt charged. The neighborhood holding its breath. Everyone could sense that something big was about to be revealed, something that would change the way they looked at Marcus, his father, and maybe even themselves. And as Marcus's father reached into his pocket, ready to show exactly who he was, the street grew silent. The whispers stopped. The weight of the moment pressed down on every person there. The woman on the porch, so quick to accuse, finally shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The deputy tightened his jaw, preparing for an answer he wasn't expecting. The truth was seconds away, and when it came, it would leave the entire street speechless. The street had gone quiet. No more whispers, no more chatter, just silence and the flashing red and blue lights sweeping across worried faces. Every eye was fixed on Marcus's father. Even the deputy stood a little straighter. Sensing something was about to happen, Marcus's father reached calmly into his pocket. His movements were slow, deliberate, showing he had nothing to hide. For a tense moment, some in the crowd thought he might argue or walk away. But instead, he pulled out a leather wallet, smooth and worn from years of use. From it, he slid out a card, official, laminated, and shining under the patrol car's lights. He held it out firmly for the deputy to see. The deputy leaned forward, his flashlight flicking on to scan the card. His eyes landed on the words, and his expression changed instantly. The hard suspicion melted away, replaced by surprise. And then disbelief. He blinked, checking twice to be sure. His lips moved, barely whispering the words, United States Navy. SEAL Chief. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People leaned closer, their eyes widening. The title carried a weight everyone understood. A Navy SEAL was already a warrior, someone trained beyond imagination, but a chief. That meant leadership, experience, and respect at the highest level. It wasn't just a job. It was honor earned through decades of service. The woman on the porch froze, her mouth opening slightly but no sound coming out. A moment earlier, she had spoken loudly, accusing Marcus without hesitation. Now, her voice was gone. Her confidence crumbled as the reality of who she was dealing with sank in. Marcus looked up at his father with pride shining in his eyes. He had always admired him, always loved hearing his stories about missions and training, though his dad never bragged or told everything. But in this moment, Marcus saw how much weight that title carried, not just in the military, but right here, in this street filled with judgmental stares. The deputy cleared his throat, suddenly careful with his words. Sir, he hesitated, shifting awkwardly. I didn't know. You didn't ask. Marcus's father replied evenly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the strength of a man used to commanding respect without needing to demand. Instead, you believed assumptions. You believed fear. He looked slowly from the deputy to the crowd, his eyes steady, piercing, making everyone feel like he was speaking directly to them. A heavy silence fell. The only sound was the faint hum of the patrol car's engine and Marcus's own heartbeat pounding in his chest. The woman on the porch tried to recover, her voice shaky. I didn't mean. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. I didn't know. His father's gaze snapped to her, not with anger, but with truth. You didn't need to know. You only needed to see. My son is a boy with a basketball. Walking home after practice, but you didn't see that. You only saw what you wanted to see. Her face flushed red. She looked down, her earlier pride shrinking into embarrassment. The people around her shifted uncomfortably, realizing how quickly they had believed her story without questioning it. Marcus's father continued, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the air. I have led men into battles most of you will never hear about. I've stood against enemies who wanted to destroy our country. But today, my own son was treated like an enemy, right here in his own neighborhood. The deputy lowered his head, slightly shame flickering in his eyes. The crowd's whispers began again, softer this time, full of guilt and unease. Marcus stood taller beside his father. The fear that had weighed on him was gone, replaced with a quiet strength. For the first time, the crowd wasn't just staring at him with suspicion. They were staring at him with shame, realizing how wrong they had been. The woman finally sank into her chair, her face pale. She had no words left. The hero, she thought. She was calling to protect the neighborhood had turned out to be the father of the boy she accused. And worse, that man wasn't just any father, he was a decorated Navy SEAL chief. Someone who had dedicated his life to protecting the very people now staring at him in silence. The truth hung heavy in the air, undeniable and unforgettable. Marcus's father slipped his ID back into his wallet with slow dignity, as though sealing the moment forever. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to threaten or shout. His identity, his truth, his service was enough to silence the entire street. The reveal was complete. The assumptions had shattered. And now, all that remained was the uncomfortable truth that everyone had judged Marcus before they even knew his name. The moment hung in the air like thunder that refused to fade. The deputy still held the memory of the ID card in his hands, his fingers trembling slightly before he finally let them drop. Around him, the crowd that had gathered just stood frozen, every face caught between disbelief and shame. For a long stretch of seconds, no one spoke. The only sound was the steady hum of the patrol car's engine and the faint rustle of leaves in the late afternoon wind. The neighborhood that had been alive with whispers, accusations, and suspicion just minutes before was now heavy with silence. Marcus stood close to his father, his chest rising and falling with relief. For the first time since the patrol car arrived, he felt safe. Yet even with his father beside him, he could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes. They weren't filled with suspicion anymore. They were filled with something else. Embarrassment, guilt, quiet regret. The woman on the porch, who had started it all, sat frozen in her chair. Her hands, which had gripped her glass of iced tea so tightly, were trembling now. The glass clinked softly as it tapped against the table beside her. She wanted to speak, to explain herself, to defend her choices. But every word died on her tongue. Her earlier confidence was gone. In its place was the dawning realization of how wrong she had been. The deputy finally cleared his throat. But even his voice seemed softer now. "Sir, I didn't realize." His words stumbled out, weak and uncertain. The authority he carried when questioning Marcus earlier had slipped away completely. Marcus's father didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm, steady tone filled the silence with more power than shouting ever could. "You didn't realize because you didn't look. You didn't listen. You saw a boy and judged him before he spoke. And that judgment could have changed his life forever." The deputy looked down, unable to meet his eyes. The truth was too sharp to direct. The crowd shifted nervously. A man in the back whispered, "He's right." Another woman near the sidewalk nodded, her voice low but firm. The boy wasn't doing anything wrong. For the first time, a few voices dared to speak up. Not against Marcus, but in his defense. Still, the silence that followed each short whisper felt heavy. It was the silence of realization, the silence of people seeing themselves in a mirror they didn't want to face. Marcus's eyes moved across the faces in the crowd. People who had once looked at him with suspicion were now avoiding his gaze. Some looked down at their shoes, others pretended to be interested in their phones, though they hadn't moved an inch since the reveal. He could feel their discomfort, but he didn't feel sorry for them. For once, they were the ones who had to carry the weight of being wrong. The woman on the porch finally tried to speak, her voice shaking. I didn't know he was your son. I didn't know you were." She stopped herself, realizing how hollow it sounded. Marcus's father turned toward her, his expression firm but calm. "You didn't need to know who I am. You didn't need to know what I've done. All you needed to know was that my son is a human being, or should have been enough." The words cut deeper than any accusation. The woman lowered her head, shame burning her face. Her earlier pride and self-righteousness had vanished completely. The silence grew thicker. Even the children who had been fidgeting earlier stood still, sensing the gravity of the moment. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Marcus glanced at his father. In his eyes, he saw strength, dignity, and something even more powerful, patience. His father wasn't just defending him. He was teaching everyone a lesson they would never forget. Finally, a neighbor across the street stepped forward. He raised his voice just enough for others to hear. "I've seen that boy plenty of times. He always walks this way. He's never caused trouble. We should have known better." Another voice followed. "She overreacted," someone muttered, glancing at the woman on the porch. We all did. But even with a few voices speaking up, the silence still hung heavy. It was the silence of realization, the kind that doesn't end quickly, because everyone is lost in their own thoughts, replaying what they had believed just moments before. Marcus's father let the silence linger. He wanted them to feel it. He wanted them to remember the weight of their assumptions, the way fear had blinded them to truth. when he finally spoke again. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but strong enough to reach every ear. Respect should not depend on a title. My son shouldn't need a Navy SEAL chief as his father to be treated fairly. He shouldn't need me to prove he belongs here. He belongs here because this is his home. That should be enough. The words sank deep, echoing in the stillness. No one could argue. No one dared to. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the sound of shame, of reflection, of people realizing they had judged without reason. It was the silence of a neighborhood being forced to confront itself. And for Marcus, standing tall beside his father, it was the first silence that didn't feel like fear. It felt like justice. Asterisk. The silence in the street lingered, thick and heavy. No one dared to speak. The flashing lights of the patrol car spun slower now, painting the neighborhood in waves of red and blue. The woman on the porch sat frozen, her pride gone, her face pale. The deputy shifted uncomfortably, his authority dissolved, and the crowd. The crowd stood still, caught between shame and realization. Marcus's father looked around at all of them. His tall figure commanding the space without a single shout. His hand rested firmly on his son's shoulder, grounding him, protecting him, and at the same time reminding everyone who is really at the center of this storm. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but powerful, carrying the weight of truth. You all judged my son before you even knew his name. You judged him because of how he looks, because of the color of his skin. Because fear whispered in your ear, and you believed it. Not one of you asked who he was. Not one of you asked where he was going. You decided he was guilty before he even opened his mouth. The words struck like lightning. People shifted, looking down at their shoes, ashamed to meet his eyes. He continued, steady and unwavering. I have worn this nation's uniform for decades. I have led men into danger, fought battles far from here, and seen things, I pray you, never see. I have stood against enemies who wanted to harm innocent lives, and yet, in the safety of his own neighborhood, my son is treated as the enemy. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The truth was too raw to ignore. Marcus looked up at his father, pride glowing in his young eyes. He had heard his dad speak with authority before, but never like this, not to strangers. Not to neighbors, not to people who needed this lesson. More than anyone, his father's voice grew softer, almost like a teacher explaining a lesson. Respect should not depend on a uniform. Dignity should not depend on a badge. My son should not need me, a Navy SEAL chief, to stand here and prove his worth to you. He is worthy because he is human. He is worthy because he belongs here, just like every one of you. The silence deepened. The woman on the porch gripped her glass tighter, but she could not find the courage to speak. The deputy's face flushed red, his hand falling away from his belt completely, as if ashamed he had ever rested it there in the first place. Then Marcus's father looked directly at the deputy. You wear that badge to protect, not to assume, not to accuse. Protect. That is your duty. Remember that. The next time you look at a young man who looks like my son, the deputy swallowed hard, nodding silently. He could not argue. The truth had cut through his defense, leaving only humility behind. The father's eyes swept over the crowd again. And the rest of you, he said firmly, ask yourselves this. What kind of neighborhood do you want to live in? One where a boy can't walk home without being treated like a criminal, or one where children are safe, respected, and welcomed. That choice is not mine, it is yours. What happened here today should never happen again. A murmur began to spread. Some nodded quietly, others wiped their eyes, the weight of guilt pressing down harder with each word. The woman on the porch finally set her glass down, her hands shaking too much to hold it anymore. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. Marcus stood taller now, no longer afraid. He felt his father's words wrap around him like armor. For the first time, the stares of the crowd didn't feel heavy. They felt powerless. They weren't looking at him with suspicion anymore. They were looking at him with shame, with regret, and maybe even with respect. The moment stretched, timeless, unforgettable. The father had said what needed to be said. No one could erase the truth. No one could undo what had happened, but they would remember. Every single one of them would remember the day the Navy SEAL chief stood before them and held up a mirror. To their prejudice, the father squeezed Marcus's shoulder gently. "Come on, son," he said quietly, his voice soft now, almost tender. "Let's go home." Together, they turned and walked down the street, past the stunned crowd, past the patrol car, past the woman on the porch who now looked smaller than she ever had. The deputy didn't stop them. The neighbors didn't move. They simply watched in silence as father and son walked side by side, strong and unshaken. For Marcus, each step felt lighter. His father's presence had turned fear into pride, shame into dignity. He knew this moment would stay with him forever, and for the neighborhood. The lesson was carved deep into their hearts. Never again would they see Marcus as a stranger. Never again would they forget the power of respect, the cost of prejudice, and the strength of one father's words. The silence of that afternoon had spoken louder than any argument ever could.